In the previous episode, Carol and Ash's plane was forced to land in Greenland, where they encountered Oon and Hannah, but Oon threatened Ash, demanding he become her lover, while Carol convinced Hannah to help them escape. Hannah killed Oon, but was then killed by Ash. Ash and Carol fled Greenland under the cover of night. Even though they had a silent agreement not to mention the two women on the island, the memories still weighed heavily on their minds, especially for Ash, who couldn't bring himself to stop and rest for a moment. By the following day, they had already reached the skies over France. Carol looked down in surprise as they continued to fly along a river, with a large city visible in the distance.
What about that light over there? Looks like a racetrack, maybe?
Yeah. Good eye. Alright, hold on.
Without a word, Ash adjusted the flight path, steering the plane toward the runway below. Soon, they were descending rapidly, landing smoothly on the runway and coming to a gradual stop. Carol pushed open the cabin door and slowly rose to step outside. For over a decade in the apocalypse, Carol had survived with Rick's group, fighting for a safe and stable shelter. She'd never imagined that one day she'd risk crossing the ocean to this foreign country. It wasn't until she set foot on this land that everything around her started to feel real. Half an hour later, Ash dragged the plane over toward the stables, planning to hide it so no one would tamper with it after they left. Carol thought about it for a long time and suggested to Ash that it might be better if he stayed here.
I don't want anything to happen to the plane.
It won't. I'll hide it.
Or to you. I don't want you getting hurt because of me. I'm responsible for you.
No, I am responsible for me. I made the decision to come here because I want to help you, okay? So, well, let me help you find your daughter.
Carol fell silent instantly. Her supposed mission to find her daughter was actually a lie. Yet Ash had still helped her without hesitation. The road ahead would surely be full of danger, and in all fairness, she shouldn't let Ash continue risking himself for her. Ash was confused. If there was danger, shouldn't they stick together? Why would she insist he stay behind? Seeing this, Carol tried a different approach to persuade him. She told Ash that the plane was their only way out. Protecting the plane is crucial, and this place seems relatively safe. She was confident he had the skills to survive here for a while. Ash agreed, realizing that in a foreign land after the apocalypse, finding someone was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It was better to prepare for a long journey ahead.
We'll need fuel. How long are you gonna be?
Not very long, I hope. If I'm not back in 2 weeks, don't keep waiting.
I'm not leaving without you.
Carol felt deeply moved. Ash's kindness always exceeded her expectations, so she made a solemn promise to him that she would return to this place. She then handed Daryl's crossbow to Ash, urging him to protect himself, and slung her rifle over her shoulder as she prepared to leave. Carol was relying solely on her determination to find Daryl. She had no clear destination or route and could only head toward the city, knowing that densely populated areas might have survivors who could offer more information. 2 hours later, Carol stopped in a square, where she could see the entirety of Paris, including the Arc de Triomphe and the Eiffel Tower in the distance. Unlike Daryl's rough journey through Paris, Carol knew nothing about the state of the apocalypse here. She could only wander the streets, hoping for a stroke of luck. Just then, an advertisement board caught her attention. Several identical posters were plastered on it, appearing to mark the symbol of a local gang. Suddenly, the roar of an engine sounded behind her, and Carol quickly ducked behind an abandoned car. A military truck soon rolled past her, and Carol shifted position, carefully staying out of sight. Unexpectedly, the military truck still stopped not far away. Carol quickly ducked and hid in the side compartment. 2 soldiers soon jumped out, grabbing a homeless man off the ground and slamming him against the wall. Carol hid across from them, silently observing and hesitating about whether or not to intervene and help the man. But before Carol could react, the soldiers started dragging the homeless man toward the truck. Seeing that they hadn't noticed her, Carol quickly darted behind the truck and swiped some food, only to notice that the bags had a logo identical to the one on the posters she'd seen earlier. Just then, a soldier up ahead heard a noise coming from the back of the truck and jogged over to check, but he didn't find anything unusual. Carol had already returned to her original hiding spot. After the soldier dismissed his doubts, he returned to the driver's seat and continued down the road with the truck full of supplies. None of them noticed that one of the food bags had a tear at the bottom, with grains slowly spilling out along the way. The hole in the grain bag, of course, had been cut by Carol. The truck loaded with supplies was clearly heading toward a community or camp. It was just that the soldiers were not very friendly, so she didn't want to approach them. Thus, she used this method to guide herself, helping her find where people were gathering. But when she reached a fork in the road, the trail of grain had disappeared. Carol hesitated, wondering which direction to take, when she heard faint noises and the murmur of a crowd from up ahead. At the corner, she spotted a large group of people gathering toward a small square. Carol also put away her rifle and pretended to be an ordinary resident as she walked over. At the entrance to the square, several soldiers stood guard, collecting weapons from everyone who entered and conducting full-body searches. Facing this unfamiliar group in a foreign place, Carol was understandably nervous, but her experience allowed her to slip into the crowd with ease. She saw the soldiers carrying boxes of supplies and lining them up in the open space in front of them. Carol hadn't yet figured out what was happening when, with a single command from a soldier, the entire crowd surged forward, each person frantically grabbing food to fill their baskets. Watching the chaotic crowd, Carol realized that this army had done this before, yet she'd also seen soldiers beating a homeless man earlier. Maybe things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. Sure enough, a female officer suddenly shouted for everyone to stop, and the crowd looked toward her in confusion.
C'est un petit aperçu de ce que la maison mère peut vous offrir. Des repas chauds, un lit douillet, de l'eau, du vin, des plaisirs simples tous les jours, mais uniquement si vous acceptez de soutenir Madame Genet. Alors, les volontaires? Tournez-vous. J'en veux 20.
The officer's voice barely faded before the residents started rushing forward again. Carol instinctively backed away, wanting to leave the area. She didn't understand what the female officer was saying, but she could guess that they were planning to take some people away. Suddenly, after the gunshot, everyone fell silent, obediently raising their hands and waiting for the soldiers to make their selections. In that moment, Carol understood the truth. The free supplies were just a ruse. This army's real goal was to pick out specific people. She turned and lunged for the back of the truck, hoping to find something to use as a weapon. Suddenly, a soldier behind Carol suddenly grabbed her shoulder, then pushed her toward the back of the truck, forcing her to sit in the very back according to the order. Behind her, two elderly men tried to get on the same truck, but the soldiers split them up without a second thought. Carol was forced to climb onto the truck, and the selected people sat down one after another. Not long after, the convoy set off, but Carol had no idea where they were being taken. At this moment, all she could do was go with the flow. Hours passed, and night fell, but the convoy still hadn't reached its destination. When a stranger tried to make friendly conversation, Carol merely offered a polite smile in return. After a while, she asked the man next to her where the convoy was actually going.
You've heard of Madame Genet? No. She's trained to start over. In New France, I was skeptical, but it's hard to argue with bread.
Remy started talking about survival, mentioning his traveling companion, a man named Julian, his husband, who was put in one of the trucks behind them. Originally, they had been struggling to survive, moving from place to place in the apocalypse. But when Julian developed a lung condition, they heard that Genet had doctors under her command, so they attended the gathering and were selected. Carol felt sympathy for their situation but shared nothing about her own past. After all, in the apocalypse, you couldn't afford to show your vulnerabilities. About 10 minutes later, the convoy passed through a gate, entering a castle, but Remy noticed something was wrong. Under the threat of the soldiers, Remy had no choice but to sit back. Carol also sensed the danger, but there was nothing she could do now. For the time being, she could only resign herself to whatever was about to unfold. Half an hour later, Sabine entered the interrogation room to report the number of volunteers to Genet. Then, she glanced at the tortured prisoner and pleaded with Genet to show mercy, but Genet refused without hesitation. A traitor couldn't be treated with kindness. She was determined to extract the location of the Union of Hope's headquarters. After Sabine left, Genet turned to the prisoner and said, "I once had high hopes for you, even wanted you to replace Sabine as my right hand. Yet you chose betrayal. You even deceived me for the sake of those foolish believers. However, I have plenty of patience for dealing with someone as stubborn as you."
L'information dont j'ai besoin, elle est à l'intérieur de toi. Et ils vont finir par sortir. La nonne, l'enfant, l'Américain.
No sooner had Genet finished speaking than Kadran, bound to the chair, let out another agonized scream. Kadran had endured scenes like this countless times before. Although he was a brutal man himself, he had never once regretted helping Daryl escape. Before the apocalypse, the painting of the Mona Lisa still hung in the Louvre, drawing tens of thousands of visitors every day. Tour guides delivered passionate explanations while nearby children played on their gaming devices. 13 years ago, Genet was just a janitor, constantly put down by her female supervisor and forced to swallow her pride while cleaning up everyone else's messes. A female colleague nearby felt indignant on Genet's behalf, but Genet said she didn't want to make a fuss about it. Seeing this, the colleague changed the subject and reminded her to be sure to attend the meeting during their lunch break. Genet really couldn't refuse, so she had to agree to the other person's invitation, and then continued to clean up the traces on the floor. Half an hour later, the lower-level employees of the museum gathered in the hallway. Officially, it was a meeting, but in reality, they were discussing a plan to stage a collective strike on Saturday morning. They intended to hand out flyers to inform the visitors of their reasons. When Genet heard this, she couldn't help but laugh.
Mais non, mais c'est vrai. On sera aux infos pendant quelques jours, ensuite le gouvernement continuera de nous baiser, comme d'hab.
It was obvious that none of Genet's colleagues agreed. This was a protest organized by the trade union, and workers had to stand together. Genet nodded indifferently. Suddenly, all their phones rang at the same time. 2 hours later, chaos had engulfed the museum. Many people were inexplicably trapped here, with their phones as their only means of contacting the outside world. Genet's husband had come to pick her up from work, but every exit was blocked. All he could do was share what he'd heard. Something major was happening outside, with the military evacuating the area and advising residents to go home and lock their doors. Since explaining over the phone was difficult, they arranged to meet at the nearest entrance. Talking on the phone as she walked, Genet was nearing the door when a guard stopped her. She quickly pointed to her husband outside, saying it was her husband, but the guards were rough and wouldn't allow her to get close, even using force to push her back. Genet was taken aback for a moment, but quickly gestured for her husband to meet her at the opposite side. He ran over, following her instructions. At the same time, people in the square were also running, as if something terrifying had appeared. The guards were frantically trying to keep order, but the noise was so overwhelming that no other sounds could be heard. Through the glass, Genet and her husband looked into each other's eyes with the intensity of lovers separated by a world. Just then, Genet's face suddenly changed. Her husband instinctively turned to look. As he was brutally killed right before her eyes, Genet's world collapsed. She couldn't understand how a perfectly ordinary day had turned into a nightmare. She screamed until her voice was hoarse, but the monsters outside didn't heed her cries, cruelly tearing her husband to pieces. Half an hour later, Genet stumbled back into the gallery. During the day, the place was packed with people, but now she was all alone. On the wall, the Mona Lisa still smiled, while Genet's eyes filled with tears and her heart was shattered. Seeing the painting again, Genet suddenly realized something. Recalling everything that had happened today, she began to laugh and cry, unable to calm herself for a long time. In the end, Genet made a decision to rebuild order in the apocalypse and establish a new France. Back to the present, the painting was still well preserved, though it now hung in a dilapidated little room. Standing opposite it, admiring the piece, was none other than the newcomer, Carol. Genet, unexpectedly finding someone who could appreciate the painting, began to chat with Carol, and then she gave her a closer look, asking where Carol was from. Carol thought for a moment and replied, "I came from the east side of Paris. 13 years ago, I was visiting as a tourist, but then the apocalypse hit, and I couldn't go back." Genet nodded thoughtfully and continued discussing their previous topic. Just then, a large man behind them cursed, complaining that the food was terrible. Before shoving his plate onto the floor, Genet looked at the scene expressionlessly.
Je vais chercher une serpillière. Non.
As soon as Genet finished speaking, everyone looked over. Although most of them had never seen Genet before, her presence still instantly commanded the attention of the entire room. Genet walked forward slowly, saying in a calm voice,
Tu comprends que la nourriture est un bien précieux.
Oui, madame.
Alors ça ne te dérangera pas de manger à même le sol.
The large man was one of Genet's soldiers, and he knew full well that orders couldn't be disobeyed. But in front of all these people, his pride held him back from immediately complying. After a long moment of silence, the man finally lowered his head and admitted his mistake. He pushed his chair aside, knelt on the floor, and began eating the food off the ground. No one here dared to defy Genet's orders, knowing the consequences were far worse than death. After dealing with the troublemaker, Genet received grateful glances from the kitchen staff.
Bon appétit! Excuse the interruption. I have no tolerance for bullies. Marion Genet, welcome to the Maison Mère.
Carol was startled. So, this woman was the most powerful leader in France right now. However, Genet was obviously not simple, and it would take some time to observe whether he was an enemy or a friend. The next day, the base was bustling with activity. Carol and Remy joined the line by the window, waiting for assignments from the staff inside. The worker glanced up and saw that they were both older, so he assigned them to the kitchen and the stables before urging them to hurry on. Carol couldn't understand the language here, but luckily Remy pulled her along and explained as they continued walking. They chatted as they headed toward the courtyard, passing a group of soldiers loading weapons. Remy continued explaining to Carol that these soldiers were being sent to attack a Union of Hope outpost. Since that organization had been opposing Genet, Genet was determined to locate their headquarters and eliminate the threat once and for all. Just then, they saw a line of people up ahead, handcuffed and being escorted somewhere. Sensing something unusual, they decided to follow quietly. The soldiers marched the prisoners through a corridor to the forest outside the base, where an iron door stood guarded by two people in white lab coats. Under the soldiers' threats, they stood against the stone wall. Carol and Remy hid behind the iron plate and watched the scene in front of them without daring to make a sound. One of the white-coated individuals picked up a syringe, injected it into a man's neck, and reminded their assistant to record the data. Gunfire erupted from behind the stone wall again apparently. This was another batch of test subjects. Remy whispered to Carol, explaining that rumors had it Genet's people were conducting biochemical experiments to create different types of violent zombies. The corroded zombies outside were the result of an accidental spread. Before he could finish speaking, the recently dead prisoners began convulsing violently and, in the next second, suddenly sprang up only to be shot down by the soldiers. It turned out Genet was attempting to create powerful, controllable zombies to fight in place of her army. Carol could only think that these people were all mad, and she grew even more worried that Daryl might have been captured as well. At that moment,
Dégagez! À moins que vous soyez volontaire pour être cobaye.
Sorry.
On y va, on y va.
Carol and Remy, still shaken, began to walk back. They decided to gather intelligence around the base immediately. Remy wanted to go with Carol to search for his husband, but Carol felt it would draw too much attention. She urged Remy to return for now, and she'd find a way to contact him once she had any information. So they parted ways. Carol went to a residential area, hiding in a secluded corner to observe. At the entrance ahead, soldiers stood guard. She'd need to find a way to slip in. Just then, she saw a group from the kitchen delivering food and quickly approached to offer her help. Just as Carol finished complaining, a guard flicked his cigarette butt into the pot before finally allowing them to pass through. The kitchen staff barely reacted, they were used to it. They simply removed the filthy items from the bucket, entered the room, and placed the food on the tables as if nothing had happened. Carol attracted no suspicion, and as food was distributed, she took the opportunity to ask around. She approached an injured man and urgently asked if he knew Daryl. Cadron replied, "I tried everything I could to capture Daryl, but in the end, I let him go and this hand is the price I paid." Carol immediately sensed that this was not a good situation. She quickly pressed Cadron for Daryl's location. There was no way Cadron would tell Carol so easily. He had been tortured to keep this secret.
There's a reason I found you. There has to be. It's a sign. Daryl Dixon. He's my brother.
Cadron froze for a moment, tilting his head slightly to continue listening. Carol was just about to explain further when a chef behind her shouted at her to hurry. She was now extremely anxious. If she missed this chance, she might never get another.
Please help me. I have come a very long way. He's the only family I have left.
On sera tous punis si on n'y va pas.
Looking at Carol's pleading eyes, Cadron hesitated for a long time before he relented. He told her, "There's a small island near the beaches of Normandy. Daryl's in the castle there." Carol took a moment to absorb this before following the chef outside. When she looked back, Cadron had already closed his eyes, as if accepting his fate and waiting for death. Returning to her quarters, Carol quickly found Remy for help. After a bit of deduction, Remy realized she was likely talking about Mont Saint-Michel. It would take only a few hours to drive there. Carol invited Remy to come with her, but he refused without hesitation. His husband needed the doctors here. Carol nodded, understanding, and reluctantly bid farewell to Remy. In just 2 days, they'd gone from strangers to close friends. Because they shared one thing in common, their loved ones meant everything to them. So, can Carol manage to escape and make it to Mont Saint-Michel to find Daryl? Tune in for the next exciting episode.